This walk and talk is called Bread or Batons, which is a kind of history of unemployed workers' struggles in Bristol, particularly in the period in 1931 and 32, which is kind of when it got very hot across the country in terms of both unemployment and also protests against unemployment. So just give you a quick idea about how unemployment changed in the 1920s and 30s. Well, after the First World War, there was a kind of high level of unemployment because obviously lots of returning soldiers. There were plenty of struggles that went on. I'm not going to go about them now, particularly of demobilised soldiers, and in Bristol that happened as well. But through the 20s, there's a basically fairly high level of unemployment in the country. It's around 10% all the way through the 1920s, and that's kind of for various reasons. But one of them is a kind of decline in British industry, particularly heavy industry. Now, Bristol didn't really have, we had some heavy industry, but didn't have the heavy industry of, say, South Wales or the North East or other parts of the country. So, as a result, it was kind of fairly mixed economy. You had the big employers like Wills and Fry's, chocolate and cigarettes. You also had BA, Bristol Aeroplane Company, and those kind of employers, and they were kind of fairly stable through the period of the Depression, fairly stable. But the industries that really got affected were all the casualised work, which was from the docks. I mean, I was reading one account from a guy from St Philip's yesterday who said, outside the big employers like Wills, Fry's and the aeroplane companies and Robinson's Packaging, a lot of the other work was still casualised. So the first people to get really hurt by the Depression were the casual workers who got booted out. So there was a huge rise in unemployment, and it occurs after the 1929 Wall Street crash, right? It's already at 10%, and after 1929 there's kind of 3 years of rising unemployment, and it goes pretty crazy at the end of 1931. To give you an idea, it went up to about 25% of the registered working population in the country, but certainly in Bristol was up to those levels. About a quarter of the population, the working registered population, were unemployed. And in Bristol itself, of the registered unemployed, there was about 26,000 at the end of 1931. So it's pretty grim. The second thing to say is what were the benefits that were available to you? Now, after the First World War, because of the kind of struggles both in the workplace and the Russian Revolution, the effect of the politicisation in Europe of the working class after the end of the First World War, you do get a lot of reforms, and you start to see reforms coming through, like unemployment benefits, early sort of insurance schemes, that kind of sort of basic benefits. The thing is though, they run like insurance schemes, so they're not like you'll get them regardless. You have to pay into them as a worker. So it's like an insurance scheme, the unemployment benefit, and you can get that back for a time depending on how much you've put in. So that was all very well for the work, the kind of more skilled, respectable working class. But for a lot of other workers, there wasn't much protection. Other reforms come in, and there's a kind of level of what harks back to the poor law, the poor relief. So there's kind of other forms of relief as well where you can get if you're in real trouble. But as you go through the 20s, you get the introduction of things like the means test. Now, by the end of the late 20s, the means test itself was one of the most hated things, particularly among the sort of casualised working class. And to give you an idea of what it was, is basically the state would say, we're not going to give you anything if you're unemployed or you're poor, you're starving, unless we have a look at your whole household. Like everybody in the household, and what they're earning, and also what assets you've got actually in your house. So yesterday, for example, a woman from Barton Hill who came to the talk said, oh yeah, my grandmother said that when they judged whether we could get any benefits, any poor relief, they came in and actually made us sell the kids' toys. You had to sell stuff in your house. You couldn't have any. You had to be really. Basically, they were saying you've got to be in absolute poverty before we'll give you anything. And the other thing it did was it meant that if you were a worker like a male breadwinner and you went to get poor relief on the means test, they would come and look at your house and and your family, and they would say, right, well, if your lodger is working, you know, then that lodger's putting some money into the household, therefore they can support you and they could reduce the poor relief on the back of that. If your grandmother was working, or your sister, they would include all of that in and to determine how much money you got. And it was hated for 2 or 3 reasons. One, because it was really demeaning for the whole family. 2, because you had to, like, you know, declare all this stuff and sell things, like. And thirdly, because from a male point of view, there's this idea of the single male breadwinner. Then, you know, you were in a position where you were sort of being emasculated effectively. You would be relying on, you know, your sister or your mother or to support you. So all of that was disliked, and I think somebody quoted and said there was no law in that period in the 20s which was more likely to cause revolution than the means test. So a lot of the demonstrations and protests are around benefits through the unemployment benefit system, and also about the means test. And in fact, if you look in the pamphlet, you know, you can see on this picture here, one of the demonstrations, there's a banner which says, you know, down with the starvation means test. Like, so it was they were the kind of key things that were behind the protests that start to happen. Why we're standing here is this is where kind of the Haymarket was, horse fair, and if you look on the map you can see it doesn't really exist anymore, it's like a park. But this is one of the main meeting points for demonstrations in Bristol by the National Unemployed Workers Movement, which I'll tell you a little about in a second. This is one of the main places where people met, and it appears in lots of the stories in this pamphlet, so we thought we'd start here. But the story of the National Unemployed Workers Movement begins in 1931 in Bristol, really. And what the National Unemployed Workers Movement comes out of, it's been around nationally for about 10 years. But in Bristol it only really gets going in 1931. It's a fairly small group of communists, socialists and trade unionists, or ex-trade unionists because they're unemployed now, who start this organisation, link it into the national movement. What the NUMWM was demanding at that stage was, first of all, a programme of public works, like effectively Keynesianism, bringing in the state intervention into the economy to deal with the depression. They were also against all cuts in benefits, all cuts in unemployment benefits, they were against abolishing the means test, and they were very clear there's a whole system of reforms, but they were the main things they were demanding. And why it comes to a head in 1931, the end of 1931, is because that's when the first hunger marches begin. So in September 1931, there's a hunger march from Wales, right, where the NUWM was very strong in South Wales, and South Wales was more deeply affected by the depression than Bristol. But so this march comes, they march, across, and what they're doing is they're coming to Bristol in September the 7th, 1931, to go up to Clifton to lobby the TUC, or the Trade Union Congress, which is happening at Victoria Rooms. Now I think it's amazing now, but the NUWM, like an organisation of the unemployed, was basically excluded from the TUC consistently. Like the trade unions really wouldn't deal with them, or certainly the TUC wouldn't deal with them. So the hunger march was a kind of way of saying, right, we're coming, we're marching from Wales, we're going to come, all we want to do is get into the Congress and tell them what the situation is, what our lives are like, and what our demands are, the programme of reforms that we want, and that we want your support. So the Welsh marchers arrive on September the 7th, and they come into town, and they're met by a few hundred Bristolian supporters, some members of the new NUWM branches, of which there were 2, one in central, one in East Bristol. And I make a note of East Bristol, we'll be coming back to why they were the most radical section of the NUWM. But anyway, a few hundred supporters meet, they come into Bristol, they have some meetings here in the afternoon, and then in the early evening, they're very tired, it's decided that they will go back to where they're staying. And they're staying in various cooperative halls and places where people could do meetings. They'll be sleeping on the floors of those buildings, 150 marchers. And they're here, the meeting breaks up and they start to proceed down Union Street, just down there, to head off to the places where they're staying. And that's when the police make their first move. And this is the first point where the police actually intervene in what's going on, with the NUWM. So what happens is the police basically baton charge the marchers on Union Street. These are, people marched, 50 to 100 miles, and they're on the way home. So it gives you a sign about what the kind of police response to these demonstrations was. Quite a few people are injured. There's a few arrests, mainly NUWM, Welsh NUWM and other NUWM members. Anyway, they scatter the people all over Castle down towards Castle Street and all that. But that's the first moment. 2 days later, the Welsh Hunger Marchers and their about 300 Bristolian NUWMers go up to try and get into the TUC Congress. They walk up to Clifton. There's a massive police presence outside the Victoria Rooms. The crowds, you know, their crowd sort of gathers outside, and a delegation tries to go in. Now they manage to get through the first police line, the small delegation that wants to go into the TUC, but then they're confronted by more police and TUC stroke heavies at the door of the Congress, where they are stopped. There's an altercation and then a fight breaks out, and they're beaten up basically. There's about 8 of them, beaten up by the police and the TUC heavies. And Wal Hallington, one of the people who actually writes about this, and you'll read about what he said in here, was right there. You know, he writes exactly. You know, you've got an eyewitness account of what happened. Outside, the crowd are held back by the police, and there's some altercations and a bit of trouble. Some people get batoned, and then basically they're stopped. But you'll see this time and time again. The NUWM did not, once they'd had, you know, been stopped to going somewhere, or they'd been a baton charge or whatever it was, they didn't go home or go to the pub and just go, "Oh, that was a nightmare." They actually held a meeting. They would always hold another mass meeting after this had happened, where they would discuss, you know, there'd be speeches to the crowd, there'd be discussions about what to do. And these meetings are big, you know, they sometimes were thousands of people. So what they do after the TUC that evening, they come back down, they come in the afternoon, evening, they come back down into Bristol, come to the Haymarket, but this time thousands of Bristolians turn out. Now, Wal Hallington says 20,000, I don't believe that figure, but certainly thousands of Bristolians turned out because they'd heard about this baton charge 2 days before, and they came down to, quote, protect the Welsh Hunger Marchers, right? Which, you know, has 2 resonances. One, that they're showing solidarity with unemployed people, and 2, that they're Welsh. No disrespect to anyone, but if you're a Bristolian, you know what that means. Like, should have built a wall, not a bridge and all that. But anyway, so that, you know, that's the first signs that the NUWM are like pulling large numbers of people on the street. People are reacting to what's going on, these symbolic protests about, you know, the Hunger March. I mean, the banner said "work or starve." You know, people reacted and defended the Welsh Hunger March. The police didn't do anything. So that's the first kind of incident. That's September 1931. After that, the NUWM grows rapidly. They're kind of seen as being the sort of stroke leadership. And there are a couple of reasons why the NUWM grew, I think. One, because the situation was so desperate at the time. The government is then, you know, the new national coalition government, very similar to what we've got now. So we've got a Labour government kicked out of power because of the economic crisis, and then a national coalition government led by Ramsay MacDonald, the Labour leader. The King purposely gets Ramsay MacDonald to lead that because he says, if we're going to cut all these benefits of the poor and the unemployed, we need a Labour Prime Minister to do that. Again, that could quite possibly have happened this time. So anyway, but instead you got the Lib Dems. So there is a kind of parallel. So they're deciding that the Labour government is out of power because it tries to bring in like 20% cuts, right? And people won't vote for that. This new national coalition coming, they want to bring a 10% cut in unemployment benefit, right? Which, you know, 10% doesn't sound a lot, but when people are already on starvation levels, it means an awful lot. Because if you didn't pay your rent, you lost your house. So people often paid their rent, tried to pay their rent, and cut back on their food because they didn't want to be destitute. So the 10% cut was what was going on, and the NUM at the end of 1931 started to organise. So that's the thing that's driving everyone forward. That key thing, stop that 10% cut in unemployment benefit. The second thing is that the people who are organising the NUWM are not like, you know, champagne socialists or whatever from up in Clifton or anything like that. They are rooted in their working class communities, particularly in East Bristol, St Philip's, St Jude's, all around Easton, those St Paul's and those areas for the East Bristol lot, in South Bristol as well, and some areas in North Bristol. They are actually activists who live in their communities, are well respected. Some of them members of the Communist Party, or the majority in the organising group were well respected, and they begin to have bigger and bigger weekly meetings, and we'll come on to that a bit later. So next what we're going to do is we're going to walk down to a place called, we're going to walk sort of back towards Old Market now through Broadmead and go to a place which you've ever heard of called the Rope Walk. Heard of Rope Walk? Where's the Rope Walk? Well, everyone says Bedminster because there's a pub there, but actually the Rope Walk sort of disappeared, but we're just going to go down Broadmead through Cabot Circus into the Rope Walk, and then we'll get on to the Riots. So we'll go this way.
Waking up.
We've got the map, we're kind of by that number 14 now, but obviously it looks very different in 1932 to the way it looks now. These four houses here and the Phoenix pub are kind of original, and they were listed, and they, as Rich said, they wanted to knock them down, I think. Yeah. They, when they were building all this malarkey, but they decided not to because they're listed. So this is basically this all the way along here. What would have run all the way down there is what's called the rope walk. This is the street, and this is kind of the actual street side, wasn't it, really? So now the reason the rope walk's important is it's one of these places that's disappeared. I mean, Bristol's had many historical meeting points. Some have been, shall we say, reconfigured, like Brandon Hill. You know, basically colonised by the people of Clifton to exclude the people of Bristol, effectively. If you go and look at that park, it's got the most regulations on. So Brandon Hill's one of those places that's been reconfigured. This is a place that's literally disappeared. So the rope walk was kind of where people, if you were coming from East Bristol, you might meet to have a meeting and then march off on a demonstration. So it was kind of appears quite a lot. The route we've just walked, sort of like Milk Street, and I think it's Leek Street, and you can see what is now Cabot Circus effectively, was the route that the marches, when they started in the Haymarket, where we've just been, most of the marches and in February, or most of the months of 1932 would start in Haymarket. They would kind of walk the route we've just done, sort of with a bit of deviation into St Paul's. And the reason they would do these winding routes was often to try and pick people up along the way. So at the Haymarket you might start with, like, I think one commentator said, one oral history eyewitness said, you know, we started with 200, by the time we got to Old Market we had 3,000. So they would kind of go a little windy route through St Paul's, around the back of, like, you know, St Jude's and St Philip's, and pick people up along the way and build the march up, and then eventually end up at Old Market, is where we're going in a minute. Right, just going to talk about the February event. So we talked about September 1931 and this moment where the NUWM really hit the stage in Bristol as the main organising and radical organisation that's going to fight against the cuts. These cuts are decided on January the 29th, 1932, and the cuts are this 10% direct cut in unemployment benefits, what we understand as unemployment benefits now. And that is like a national decision, but also a local decision, because although poor relief and some forms of unemployment benefits in the 20s were often paid out locally, they were dealt with locally by your sort of local district councils and stuff like that. The problem they had in the 20s is that because these local sort of distribution of these benefits meant that they could be got at politically, because you've got to remember the working class has got the vote now, sort of in the 20s almost, and so people have got the vote, and also they're politicised, so they will go and actually try and put pressure on the local authorities if they're trying to cut poor relief or to increase poor relief. And that could be you could literally put pressure. So if you go to somewhere like, you know, Durham or Northumberland in the late 1920s, the poor relief's really good, because they've been pressurised so much locally. So national government wants to try to take control of all this unemployment benefit and stuff and stop it being kind of affected by local politics. And that's what's going on through the 20s. But there was still a kind of connection. So for example, the 10% cut in benefits is decided on the 29th of January 1932. It's kind of decided by the local public assistance committee. They're the people who give the money out, but they're also connected to the local council where it's being debated. So when this decision is made, it's going to be debated in the council. So the decision is made to bring the 10% cut, but there's going to be then a kind of debate about it on the 9th of February 1932. So the NUWM immediately spring into action at the end of January and decide to call a demonstration to basically lobby the council, put a delegation into the council and lobby the council outside to try and get them to overturn this decision that the Public Assistance Committee makes, right? So they call the demonstration, they meet in the Haymarket, and there's several hundred people, if not 1,000 people there, and then they have some speeches, and I mean I'll read out just one little quote from here from one of the speeches that was made at the Haymarket where we just were. So at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Shrove Tuesday or Pancake Day, 1932 they meet, and one speaker from the NUWM at the Haymarket, the newspapers report. You've got to remember the newspapers are fairly right-wing, if not, pretty sort of sympathetic to the corporation, the way Bristol's run, the council. So they're picking out the things that they think are really, really dangerous, that these dodgy communist Reds are saying. One speaker just says, threatened that if there was another imperialist war, so referring to the First World War, it might be followed by one in which the workers take part and we should have civil war. So these, according to newspapers, the speeches are not, just about the reforms and, about unemployment. There's, pretty political stuff going on in these meetings. That's as much as we know from some of the accounts. So they're kind of covering what they're doing, but also about the wider politics as well. When they were in the Haymarket, I forgot to point out, but Bridewell police station is very close to where we were, and one of the guys who was actually on these demonstrations in February said, it was really funny when we formed up in the Haymarket, because we looked on top of Bridewell, towards Bridewell, and they had all their telescopes and cameras up watching us. And I kind of laughed, because I thought there's quite a few parallels, but I didn't know they got up to all that surveillance, but of course they did, didn't they? So they were watching from top of Bridewell this march. They followed the route that we've just been on. They joined up with people from the rope walk as well, and headed towards Old Market. And as I said, the aim was to take this body of people and a delegation of the NUWM to the council, which was in session in the afternoon. So what we'll do now is we'll walk kind of the route it would have gone and end up on Old Market, and we'll see what happens on February the 9th. We'll go that way, yeah. Right, so you kind of followed the route of the demonstration now, so you've got to pretend you're a load of angry, unemployed Bristolians, which some of you probably are anyway, But at this stage, you decide you're on the way to the council house. The route to the council house, which is on Corn Street, is straight down there, right? And this is where they were headed. They came round the top of Lawford's Gate, and then they head down here, about 3,000 strong. There was a lot of banners. One of the banners I think was one of my favourites, which said we want power, not pancakes, because it was pancake day. So down with the means test. There were red flags with the NUM communist members, and a lot of banners and stuff. And a fairly it was totally peaceful demonstration. Coming down the street. So this is February the 9th, right? 2 weeks before the main event, but it's important February 9th because it kind of lays out what the police strategy is clearly to everybody who's on that demonstration. So heading down here, and as Woodley said earlier on, Old Market, there's been about a third of Old Market chopped off by that roundabout. So if you look at your map, referring to your map, if you've got one, if you look at what you can see, if you can see David Street, well, that whole block between David Street and Carey's Lane has disappeared for the roundabout. So Stag and Hounds wasn't actually on the corner of anything. Well, it's on the corner of David Street if you look on the map. So to give you an idea, that they were sort of heading right down here, and Castle Street, which is the route to the council house, starts literally where the Castle Park is, and we'll go there in a minute. But why I've stopped here is because what you would have seen in on February the 9th, 1932, as you march down here, you would have seen a line of police literally through the middle of that roundabout. It would have been across the whole of Old Market. There was a rows of police. There were mounted police there as well. The chief constable would have been there on his horse with mounted policemen as well. And now the point about this march was there was an agreed route which the police determined, and it's not clear to me from looking at the sources whether they were actually saying you can't go to the council house before the march. But certainly the police made a decision at this point that this march of 3,000 with a delegation of NUWM to go to the council was not going to the council house. That was the decision that was made. It was, sorry mate, poke his eye out. Five grand that is. No, so you would have come in down here, you'd see these rows of police, mounted police, and the crowd basically marched down to what is now was Carey's Lane, which is the right turn there. They were stopped, and they basically tried to divert the whole march down what is now Temple, or the inner city ring road, to the right. So the police made a decision, you're not going there. What's unclear is where the march was meant to terminate, and I guess the police might have been sending them back to the Haymarket, which they kind of like the Haymarket on one level because Bridewell police station is right next to it. So I'm thinking they probably wanted them to go back to the Haymarket. But they make this decision, the crowd gets down, we'll walk down there in a minute because I want to talk about the second event. They get to Carey's Lane there, they're stopped by the police, You know, there's a bit of an altercation, and the police just basically say, right, you're going down there. The crowd refused to do that and said, no, we're marching to the council house to send this delegation to lobby this meeting. We're not, you know, there was the NUN leadership at the front, and at that point the police drew their batons and charged the crowd and scattered it all the way up here in Old Market. And this is not where this photograph comes from, that's 2 weeks later. The reason I mentioned February the 9th is because you've got to see all of these demonstrations. I think this event on Old Market is often seen in isolation. You've got to see what was going on before that to understand why the February the 23rd event really kicked off. So they get scattered, baton charged by the crowd, some people injured. I think there was no arrests as usual in these events, and I'll just read you kind of an eyewitness like talking about it. So this is an unemployed guy from St Philip's who talked about what happened on that day, and he said the police on mounted horses and other police with batons charged us and drove us right back up here past this bookshop. Oh yes, people got hurt, people who weren't even in the scuffle. I can remember a little lady there was a man and a woman there, they was clubbed down. They said they'd just come out from the pictures and they had nothing to do with it. Well, of course the police didn't know who they were. I know what I'd done. I ran across Old Market Street and jumped on a tram because the tram terminus is just down there. I got on top of the tram, so the copper who was following me on horseback with a nightstick, you know, because he was chasing him and hitting him as he was going to break up the demonstration. This guy escaped by climbing onto a tram in this thing. So it was pretty mad down this street. There's no photographs of it. There were no, doesn't appear to be any, or at least there's no photographs as dramatic as this one. You can see if you look in the on the photographs in the middle that there's a couple. I think one from West. These two here. The first one here is that one with the down with the means test is actually here. Is the one. There's few photographs. The next demonstration was a lot more. So what happens next? The police then decide that there's no way that that crowd is reforming, those 3,000 people. So they basically scatter them. They spend hours in the afternoon dispersing them, not letting them meet anywhere. And eventually, despite that, the NUWM, of course, call their host failure to get to the council meeting, which they call for the evening. And again, this is this kind of symbolic of what's going on, how the crowd is starting to react to what the police are doing. So they call a meeting in the evening back at the Haymarket. 700 to 800 protesters actually get there, because you've got to remember the police are harassing them all day, not letting them, you know, stand in groups or anything like that. But down at the Haymarket, these 700 to 800 people gather. They're kind of kettled by the police at the Haymarket. They still do their speeches. They say they're going to march again. They're going to do it again. And at that point, there's kind of an altercation begins, because whilst these speeches are going on, you've got to imagine they're surrounded by police. A motor car burst into flames. And when I said this yesterday, I think a few people laughed, because motor cars, you know, these days don't just burst into flames. So maybe somebody set fire to it, I don't know. But probably in those days they did burst into flames quite a lot. But anyway, a motor car burst into flames at the Haymarket. And everybody used that, well, quite a number of the crowd used that as an excuse to start chucking rocks from that park and stuff at the police. And there was a bit of a mini riot. They stormed out, hundreds of police stormed out Bridewell, and they baton charged the crowd and broke up the meeting in the Haymarket. So twice that day they've had their march broken up by the police, right, even though they haven't been violent. And then the second, because of the response of the crowd, you know, angry with the police because people have been battered, there's trouble, they get their meeting broken up as well. But they don't lie down. They go, right, we're going to do it again. And on February the 23rd, 2 weeks later, when the council are again meeting and debating this stuff, and it's almost like the council are waiting to see what they're going to do before they actually make the decision to fully implement the cuts. And you'll see this go on all the way through these months. So on February the 23rd, they gather again to repeat it. This time, though, they're not talking about a few thousand people gathered on the march, or 200 at the start. We're talking about thousands of people turn up. So it's got bigger. So the police violence hasn't led to it being diminished. It's led to it expanding, you know. And to give you an idea, the figures for February the 9th were about 3,000. The figures for February the 23rd on the demonstration, by the time it got to Old Market, it had gone from somewhere, it was somewhere between the minimum figure, which was the right-wing press, 3,000, up to like 15,000. So somewhere between 3,000 and 15,000 people turned up for this demonstration. Let's say 10,000 or something. So 10,000 people, they follow a similar route to the one on the 9th we've just been. They come back down Old Market, and I'm just going to describe what one of the newspapers said. In fact, perhaps we'll do it here because we'll walk down there in a minute. But similar thing happened this time though. The march comes down in much bigger, right? I probably think much more vociferous this time, and they head down, but this time the police have got a different plan. And it's clear that the police have changed their strategy, right? This time they're not going to try and divert the march and baton charge it. This time they're going to try and chop the head of the march off and beat them up. That's the plan, okay? It's the NUWM leadership are at the front, so they set their cordon much further back, not on the roundabout. They set it basically right at the end of Old Market Street at Castle Park, and we'll go there in a minute and we'll have a look. Meanwhile, they've also, just on Carey's Lane, just that right turn down there, there's a place called the Empire Palace of Varieties, which is a huge sort of music hall, or the Empire Theatre as it was known. And the police chief, who's here on his horse, decides to hide 2 motor coach loads of police in the annex to the Empire Theatre just down there. And the reason is, his plan is let the march come all the way down here, past Carey's Lane, down to the end of Castle Street, stop it, and then basically launch this attack from behind, on just where the roundabout is from the Empire Theatre. The police will run out, chop the first sort of dozen rows of the march off where all the NUWM leadership are, and then they can be sorted out. They'll be surrounded and sorted out from the front and from behind. And then the idea was then to break the march up. So the march comes down here, passes Carey's Lane, meets the police cordon, and that's precisely what happens on February the 23rd. The police charge out there. There's an altercation. Now the media, this is what one of the newspapers said, called the Bristol Evening World, which is a precursor to the Bristol Evening Post, so you kind of know where they stand a lot of the time. But this is what they said happened, right? And the newspapers' accounts differ, which is quite interesting. But this is what they said. They said, at the unemployed headquarters at Shepherd's Hall, over which continually floats the red flag, a posse, red flag. A posse of police barred the way. For a time the crowd halted, but eventually, urged on from the back, it advanced again and the police drew batons in readiness. Immediately came a shower of missiles, half bricks, coke, gas piping and iron bars, all of which had been collected by the procession en route. Immediately the police charged. In a moment the demonstrators were scattering in all directions, those who stood their ground being speedily dealt with. Again and again the police swept through their ranks and 2 ambulances were soon busy carrying casualties to the infirmary. That's what the Bristol Evening Post said. Right, it's pretty much the same. But actually that's not really what the Western Daily Press said, who said, oh, there was the march met the police line on February 23rd, and then there was kind of some pushing, and then the police decided to baton charge. There were no missiles being thrown. Other newspapers said the same. So it seems like the Bristol Evening World, kind of reporter probably had some problem with time travel or something, because he's kind of reversed everything. Because what actually happened is that when that march confronts the police down there and the police baton charge it, the police come out of the annex to the theatre and chop the head of the march off, chaos ensues. There's fist fighting, there's fighting here, and everybody runs off all around this area to try and get ammunition, right? So all down this side of the street here, there would have been barrows like costermongers selling fruit and veg. So all those are raided, all the potatoes, all the fruit and veg was thrown at the police. People ran off to scrap yards, a brick lorry was raided, and they started throwing missiles at the police down here. This is as the police are baton charging up the street, which is what this photograph, or you can see a better version behind Hydra Books there, kind of. What's going on? That's happening right here, right outside. And that photograph is when the riot is actually beginning. That's one of the baton charges to force the crowd down Old Market. People start grabbing ammunition, rob the brick lorries, take all the fruit and veg, everything gets cleared and thrown, and there's a huge amount of determined resistance from this crowd not to be forced away from the council house again. It turns into a riot. You could say it was started as a police riot. And then, so there's some coal lorries at the top of the bottom of West Street there, top of Old Market. Coal lorries get raided, all the coal's taken off and thrown at the police. There's running battles all up and down this street. And to give you an idea of the scale of it, it took them nearly 2 hours to suppress this riot in St Philip's and St Jude's. It spread right the way down to to Trinity, down the end, and it spread into local areas as well. So it was not something that was just one baton charge and everybody ran like in November or February the 9th. This time the crowd didn't run. And also, they had to try and seize West Street with continual mounted police charges down there, right? And this went on, I said, for about 2 hours, right? Very serious. A lot of people were injured initial. Rumours went around Bristol, women had been killed, that there had been a huge number of seriously injured people. There was 30 people injured in the first baton charge down there. And, you know, so these rumours are going around Bristol, and we're just going to walk down now towards Castle Park and we'll see what happened next. This whole area was obviously bombed in the Second World War, but you've got to imagine now you're kind of entering one of the main shopping streets in Bristol. So you're like, you know, Castle Street through there was like, you know, shops, and you know, it's where everybody went, everybody perambulated. There were a whole load of streets on Castle Park as well, which have all disappeared. You can see on the map. Fairly central bit of Bristol. In fact, Castle Park, I think, is BS1 1AA, which is the centre of Bristol, is right there. So, you know, obviously not in the same way anymore. So what happens after this riot that's occurred? You know, when the police, you know, basically the police cordon I was talking about would have been right here, where they met it, and then they were ambushed from behind on the other side of that block of buildings. So the head of the march is chopped off here, and then the rioting, they try and push the march all the way up Old Market, and there's the 2 hours of rioting. Again, the NUWM, after this incident in the afternoon, they don't lie down. They're like, right, we're calling another meeting this evening. So they call a mass meeting, which they do every time. They refuse to just sort of trundle off home. And they decide to call that mass meeting on Welsh Back, which is, we're going to walk down there a little bit in a moment. I'll just give you an idea about what's going on at that moment. So in the evening, they call the meeting. There's been lots and lots of people injured. Rumours have gone around the city of women being killed, and you know, it's really gone like wildfire by word of mouth at that point. So the idea is to call them in a Welsh Back. The hardcore sort of several thousand who support the NUWM are going to meet in Welsh Back. But when they arrive there, and we'll walk down there in a moment, they find they're not alone. Very much similar to the September 1931 stuff where people came out to defend the Welsh hunger marches. Actually, in Castle Park and all around these streets, I'm going to walk down in a minute, there were thousands of people turned out, down by Bristol Bridge, Peter Street, Bridge Street, Castle Street. Everybody was there, and everybody was waiting to see what would happen. Right? And it's clear from all the accounts that those crowds had come out, one, to support the NUWM or support those unemployed men, but also because they wanted to have a go at the police. That's absolutely clear. There's groups of people all over this area who are in altercations. Obviously the police are shadowing the NUM the whole time after this riot. And it's kind of a very tense atmosphere, although there is a division between those who are at the mass meeting and those people who are outside waiting to see what's going to happen. Everybody's waiting to see what the NUWM will do, and we'll walk down there now and find out what happens. Right, if you refer to your maps, then you can probably see we're near that number 9. We're by the boathouse, is just down there, I think, still there, hopefully. It's Bristol Bridge if you're not from Bristol, just over there. The reason we've come here is obviously, as I explained, there was all this is a main shopping area and all that, and you know, certainly a place, the route that the marches actually wanted to go on, because the council building, you don't know, on Corn Street, sort of Wine Street, Corn Street is just up there, beyond that big block there. So that's where the march was obviously going. You know, if these marches were going to go to the council house, that's where they were headed. So after the riot on the afternoon of February the 23rd, and after constant police harassment in the afternoon, then the NUWM decided to hold a meeting at Welsh Back, which is on the other side of the bridge over there. All this area, all the way along here, Bridge Street, up towards Wine Street and all that, is just full of people waiting to see what's going to happen, along with lots and lots of police who are shadowing the mass meeting down there. So at the end of that meeting, there's a kind of they're singing songs, and the International and the Red Flag, and also they famously all shouted out, which is again eyewitness reporters are all at these The interesting thing now is we're not like February the 9th. There's reporters here. There's people making, there's police spies taking notes in all the meetings. There's lots of accounts that start appearing because people are obviously being energised by the fact that there's been a major incident. So you get quite a lot of accounts of what happened. But at the end of the meeting, whilst there's all these sort of raucous crowds, altercations between them and the police all around this area, at the end of the meeting they shout out, they said that the meeting finished with cries of, "Are we downhearted?" And all the people in the meeting shouted no, and then they started singing the red flag and they started to move off from Welsh Back. And what they were doing, the contingent from East Bristol, who I mentioned earlier on, the East Bristol NUWM were probably the most radical section of the NUWM in Bristol, and they would have been like, probably 1,000 people come from down that way, maybe more, would have to head back along here, along Bridge Street, along Castle Street, back down Old Market and back home. As they move off, trouble starts, and the trouble starts because the police are trying to shadow them. The crowds are all booing and jeering the police who are sort of surrounding them as they start to move in this direction. And at that point, a stampede begins, right? And a large crowd of people who've been at the top of Bristol Bridge stampede down through this area, through Bridge Street, Peter Street and Castle Street, and start smashing windows and molesting motor cars, is what it said. You have to put, these motor carriages of the period were not something that most people had, obviously. So if you were in 1932 and you had a motor carriage, or whatever it was, motor car, then you were clearly wealthy, and they get attacked. Right? So they're opening doors, they're booting these motor vehicles in, and motor carriages, and windows are going through quite extensive damage down here. But this is not, it appears, the NUWM crowd that's come to the meeting. This is other people who've turned up and there's trouble with the police. So it's kind of chaos here as the NUWM make their way home. The police decide not to baton charge them, which is interesting. Right, so there's trouble, the police are running in all different directions, just chaos for about half an hour to an hour. Anyway, that's the end of February the 23rd, that's the end of that day, right? But several things happen as a result. First of all, the council, a delegation did actually finally get to the Corn Street in the afternoon of that day, and they were turned away by a police cordon. But the council said in its wisdom, "Oh, we will meet you now," right? We've decided we're not going to exclude you. So this is a group that's excluded from the Labour movement, the TUC, excluded from local political power, not even allowed to talk to them. And now the local council say, yeah, we'll invite you to the next meeting, you can send a delegation in. So clearly the riot has done something for all it's worth, is that now they're willing to actually, one, listen, whatever that means, two, possibly negotiate. The other interesting thing is the cuts are put off for a month, so they kind of delay the decision, right? So they put the cuts off for a month. So it's appeared to everybody now that, actually there's something can be done here. You can, and whether you need to riot to achieve that, or whether there needed to be that kind of, reaction to the police and all that to get these things, I don't know. Whether they achieved that, I don't know. But it looks to me like there was some crumbling going on in the council and certainly amongst the police. But crumbling in the police was a different kind of crumbling. They realised after that riot, I think that basically it wasn't going to be easy to break these demonstrations up. So you've got to remember, they've broken up the one in September 31, they've broken the one up on February the 9th, 32, and they've had a good go at beheading and breaking up the march on February the 23rd, except they got 2 hours of rioting as a result, and that wasn't a result for them. They were not happy about that. And so their tactics begin to change, right? It's the first sign that the police are starting to try and investigate a different way of dealing with this movement. I'll come on to that in a moment, because there's one more incident I want to tell you about which is infamous and really, really changed the state of play in Bristol politically around the NUWM, and that there was demonstrations of pickets going on consistently. On Peter Street, this is Peter Church here, Peter Street, which doesn't exist anymore, was where the Public Assistance Committee was that set the, that gave out the benefits, and where the 10% cut was being made. There were pickets there constantly. There was mass activity. Just over there, where am I looking now? Over that way. I don't think where it is now. Do you know where Mary Bush Lane is? If you look on the
From the back of the...
just to the back of...
Ambulance.
Yeah.
So
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, Marybush Lane School, if anyone knows it, which I think is still there, isn't it?
Yep.
That school was where the NUWM East Bristol used to meet, so they had their weekly meetings there. And during February, the CID, CID intelligence reports that we've read a lot of the police stuff, was, what they noticed is that, I think probably worried them, was that because, despite this baton charge and breaking one march up, despite this second baton charge and then a riot happening, this violence is not affecting the NUWM, it's not reducing it, it's massively expanding it. So the NUWM meetings in the end of February, there's like 400 people turning up to their weekly meeting. So they have to have like an overflow meeting out in the street, and all across Bristol, the NUWM meetings, that's a big, if you're just having a weekly organising meeting and 400 people turn up to it, it kind of tells you something of what's going on, which is there's a lot of interest and the movement itself is growing rapidly. So what the police have seen is that violence has led to more people on the marches, more people at the meetings because their police spies are there, taking notes or whatever. And they're seeing that their movement's growing. So clearly their tactics aren't changing. So they change their tactics, but they do one more thing on June the 9th, which is one of the most brutal attacks on a demonstration probably in the 20th century in Bristol. The whole series of demonstrations continue, the cuts keep getting delayed. On June the 9th, they decide to hold another big march, which they do, and this time they get away with it without a baton charge. Interesting. Everybody's thinking, oh, we've got somewhere now. Again, they have a meeting, I think, down on Welsh Back in the evening, on June the 9th, 1932. And then the various contingents of the NUWM are making their way home. So the East Bristol contingent, which is about, I think, 700 or 800 people, with their banners, were leaving about 10:30 in the evening in June, and they're walking back this way along Castle Street, right along here. Some of the demonstrators, as they walk home, some of them are singing the International, some are singing popular songs or whatever. Some of them notice something strange, which is all the street lights are out on Castle Street. Right? Well, the street lights are on in other places, but they're out on Castle Street. People think that's a bit odd, must be a power failure. As they get down the street, they suddenly get ambushed by hundreds of police from all directions who are basically concealed. They're being shadowed by a small amount of police, but then they get hit by hundreds. Unfortunately, the police have planned this ambush basically to beat up the most militant section of the NUWM in Bristol and teach them a lesson once and for all. So rather than taking them on when there's thousands of people, they decide to take them on as a group of several hundred people. Unfortunately for the police, the Regency Cinema was on Castle Street and happened to have finished its film showing, and everybody piled out. So loads of Bristolians piled out of the cinema and walked into the middle of this massacre, because the police are beating everybody. And you can read the account of it in here, which is, it was interesting writing an article for the Evening Post this week and quoting this stuff back from the Evening Post in 1932. The Evening Post was actually in existence at that point. But just a sec, I'll just read it out to you. Find it. Right, okay. One person who came out of the cinema, and I think there was an Evening Post reporter there, may have been on the street or with the demonstration. The street looked like a battlefield. Men lay prone in every direction and blood ran on the pavement. So that's not an exaggeration. 70 people were injured by the police attack. 29 of them seriously, no police were injured, and there were no arrests. Okay, which tells you something. No arrests, no police injured, 70 people injured. But unfortunately for the police, as I said, despite they put the street lights out, the street lights came on after the incident, which was obviously to stop people taking photographs, I think. Unfortunately, obviously, hundreds of people saw what happened, and there was outrage in Bristol about this. I mean, first of all, we got the Labour Party suddenly decides to do something. They didn't do much before that. They decided to do something. They're in the council and they're like saying we need a public inquiry and all this, there's stormy meetings in the council house about it. The press, interestingly, have been obviously supporting the police all the way through, suddenly break ranks. Like the Western Daily Press actually puts on the front page, the front article, police ambush on Castle Street. So they're calling it an ambush, and everybody says it's an ambush. Everybody knows it's an ambush. Even the Bristol Evening World, which is kind of the equivalent, or the Bristol Evening Post as it was then. Even the Bristol Evening Post is trying to trying to get around this problem of like trying to always blame the violence on the demonstrators, so then the police have to respond. This is just, they kind of avoid that. They can't really deal with it. So the press are in consternation. The political parties in the council are in all sorts of consternation. The police are in all sorts of trouble. You know, they've had to hold press conferences after the February 23rd riot, trying to blame it on the demonstrators. This time they've got nothing to stand on. The idea was it was going to be a quick bang attack, no photographs out of there, no one saw anything, and then they would lay it on card. They've got to do something quickly, the Bristol police, to deal with this. So what do? They launched their new strategy, which they've been planning for a few months, since February the 23rd. The Chief Constable of Bristol Police has been talking to the Chief Constable of Manchester Police about how do you deal with the NUWM, how do you stop them. And the Manchester Chief Constable says, you know what you want to do? You want to use this incitement law we've found. It's great. What you do is you put some policemen into a meeting, and as soon as they say anything about class war or setting up a workers' defence group or stewarding, then you can do them for incitement. Right, and then you can nick all their leaders. The Bristol Chief Constable maybe loves this. So after the June incident, this is where they start to use it. So what do? They actually arrest 3 leaders of the NUWM, and they say, oh, we had some police at your meeting, which they did, and we heard you say these things. Therefore, the reason there was violence on the Castle Street ambush was because you'd planned to premeditate violence on Castle Street. Complete and absolute rubbish. But it works. They get them in court as a show trial. In that trial, the 3 leaders make a very honest and accurate defence of what they said. I mean, like Charlie Webber, for example, one of the leaders in UWM, says, yeah, I did say we needed a workers' defence force to defend ourselves from police violence. And that's what we were talking about, because we get attacked all the time, baton charge. We need a group of people to defend the march. And so he doesn't lie. He says, and then there's other things attributed to him. But at the end of the day, the 3 of them, 2 get 6 months in prison, and the 3rd one gets a year, which is pretty serious for not actually doing anything. It's just words.
Roger, you didn't happen to know if they appealed their sentences, do you?
I don't know. I'll have to go and look. He might. I wish Dave was here to know that. But the point is that this seems to work, because it distracts the press away from what's happened in Castle Street. There is no inquiry. Distracts everybody and says, oh look, these evil leaders, they were planning this, but absolutely ridiculous. But they think, oh great, and by the end of the year they've locked up 18 of the NUWM leaders in Bristol through the similar charges. So it seems to work. What we do is, rather than taking on the Bristolian crowd, what we can do is ambush them. That backfired. What we'll do is we'll just arrest all the leaders, and that's exactly what they did. Spent the rest of the year putting charges together, using police spies and infiltrators to try and put these people in prison, and they successfully did that, and that did affect the NUWM. Right, I'm going to kind of finish there, and we'll walk back to the Hyde if you want a cup of coffee, but I just want, the last couple of things is to say what were the impact of these events in February and June, what actually happened. Well, those cuts were delayed for a long time. Clearly the NUWM put itself in a position of being completely excluded politically, whether on the labour movement or to a point where it was the main negotiating force around unemployment protest in Bristol by miles. There were other organisations, but they kind of withered and died a little bit at that time. So they become the most important group. They certainly organised where they lived with people who were in the position that they were in themselves. I mean, if anybody thinks the Communist Party was like, at the time, was like a bunch of intellectuals up in Clifton, it's not true. And their composition was, they were from working class, inner city working class area of Bristol. They were a mixture of skilled and unskilled workers, but most interestingly, I think, with the three of the leaders that I talked about were 2 labourers and a warehouseman. So they weren't from the aristocracy of labour or anything like that. So as an organisation, they were very rooted. They did organise, and they were very, very effective very quickly in actually getting something to happen on the streets. And the fact that they could pull those 5,000 to 10,000 people out is a real testimony to their connection to the working class communities they were in and how much they were respected. And at last